Morning. Good morning, St. John's. That's better. We're going to go live in just a moment, so I'd like to invite everyone to come on in and come have a seat. I have free books to give away, but I'm only giving them away to people who sit towards the front. We can do this. I know we can. Please come on up and have a seat. We are so excited to have Dr. Clark with us this morning, and we will again go live just momentarily. Enrique, let me know when it's time. It's time? Okay. Good morning. Welcome to St. John's Cathedral. I am Tina Clark, Director of Formation, and it is my great delight this morning to welcome back to St. John's Dr. Bonnie Clark, who is a professor of archaeology at the University of Denver, DU. She is also the curator of the Museum of Archaeology at DU, correct? She's the curator of archaeology for the museum. I apologize. Dr. Clark's passion is to bring history to life using the tangibility, so the things we can touch and taste and smell and look at. And she's done that beautifully in her work at the Amachi Project. Amachi, if you don't know, is the Japanese internment camp, Japanese-American internment camp in southeastern Colorado. And I will leave it to Dr. Clark to talk about that, and also to please talk about the significance of today and us having you here today. Before I do that, I want to thank the members of our green team. St. John's Green Team is here, both here in Dagwell Hall and out at the table outside St. Martin's. And they've got a fabulous Lenten calendar for us. And they really were instrumental in helping me put together this series, which concludes today, starting with Dave Johnson from the zoo and the Katie Adamson Conservation Fund, and last week's Kim Yuan Farrell talk from the Park People. So thank you so much to the Green Team for this and for all that you do to help us be mindful of being good stewards of creation. So let us pray. Almighty God, thank you for bringing us together here in person and online. Guide and shine your light over us that we may look at your creation and understand that we are intricately woven into all you have given us, and that the non-human beings with whom we share this earth are relying on us to be better and to be more mindful. Grant that we may walk in your ways and delight in your will all the days of our lives. In the name of your Son, our Savior, we pray. Amen. Dr. Clark, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. So apologies, in order to get this done in 45 minutes, I'm actually mostly going to be reading from a script, so it just keeps me on track. But I'm delighted to be here. As Tina noted, I was here about 6 years ago as I was developing ideas for this book, so it's really a very honor to come back and be able to present to you on the finished product. So I want to start today with some words that I think people rarely associate with sites of incarceration: beauty, hope, community. And yet in the 8 seasons of archaeology that I've led at Amachi, where Japanese Americans were confined during World War II, my crews and I have consistently found evidence that those ideals were expressed, especially in the gardens there. And the backstory to these gardens is one of the bitter ironies of American history. So the late 19th and early 20th century was characterized by both a fascination with Japanese design, especially as it was expressed in gardens, and a simultaneous mistrust of Japanese people. So particularly in California, it became a status symbol for non-Asians to have Japanese-style gardens or to employ a Japanese gardener. And yet many of these same residents likely supported restrictive legislation like the state's 1913 Alien Land Law, which prevented Asian immigrants who were, by federal law, classified as aliens ineligible for citizenship from owning land in California. So the law was primarily aimed towards Japanese farmers who, since the 1880s, had been immigrating to California and other West Coast states. So some of this first generation came from farming families in Japan with skills in high-yield farming of the Pacific Rim. But they were often joined by others who were pushed into agriculture by anti-Asian unionism and other professional restrictions. So by 1940, 43% of West Coast Japanese were employed in agriculture, and another 26 managed agricultural-related businesses like produce stands or nurseries. So this is a population who had literally put their roots down into American soil. But Pearl Harbor would change all of that. So in the wake of the attack on December 1941, what had been a more general anti-Asian sentiment really flared and focused on people of Japanese ancestry. So on February 19th, that is the anniversary today, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. So that's what allowed the United States government to exclude anyone, including citizens, from an area of the US if it was deemed a military necessity. And one of the things that should give us pause is that executive order said nothing specifically about people of Japanese ancestry. It was an open ticket. But it was clear that they were going to be the target of the order. The Department of War soon established the West Coast of the United States as an exclusion zone. So throughout the spring of that year, residents of the area would find these notices posted in prominent locations proclaiming that people of Japanese ancestry were to be evacuated, meaning they were to be removed from their homes for an as yet determined period of time. And once an exclusion order like this was posted, incarcerees only had typically 1 week to put their affairs in order. So they were allowed to bring only what they could carry, and the decision of what to leave and what to bring was a very difficult one. And oral histories suggest that among those precious belongings were sometimes seedlings, and also archaeologically we've discovered pretty good evidence that they are also bringing with them seeds. So as someone told me, seeds are small, they're easy to pack. So after they were forced from their homes, Japanese Americans were first housed in makeshift accommodations, and these detainment centers sprung up nearly overnight in locations up and down the West Coast that, like this one, these fairgrounds, were never meant to house people. And so despite the fact that these assembly centers were to be inhabited for only a few months, many imprisoned there embarked almost immediately on planting gardens. And it tells us that maybe these gardens aren't so much about what you grow, but that you grow. After several months at such as these assembly centers, incarcerees were taken via train during the summer of 1942 to one of the 10 quickly built confinement centers in the interior of the US. So this map shows the extent of the exclusion zone along the Pacific Rim. The Japanese American population of this area was about 120,000 people, 2/3 of whom were citizens. It also shows the location of the 10 primary incarceration sites to which that population was sent. These were managed by a civilian agency, the War Relocation Authority, or WRA. And the official name given by the WRA to the camp in Colorado, which is circled here on the map, was the Grenada Relocation Center, which is named for the small town that's adjacent to the camp. But it quickly came to be known by its postal designation, which was Amache. Amache is located in the Arkansas River Valley of Colorado. And the central camp area was a square mile that was enclosed by barbed wire and guarded by armed military. And like all 10 of the camps, it was actually designed to be self-sufficient so as not to tax a system that was already experiencing food shortages. So the entire project area included 10 square miles, mostly pre-existing agricultural facilities, including irrigated fields, a working dairy, and a cattle ranch. And these were worked by incarcerees who were paid a very minimal salary, typically about $16 or less per month. The central camp area is located on a sandy terrace that's above the actual valley floor. And it's really minimally productive land that since the 1870s has primarily been used for cattle grazing. The native vegetation are hardy plants like this yucca that's featured in a graphic that was created by artists at Amache. And in fact, every single one of the trees that you see in this overview photograph is not native. It was planted there by an incarceree. So the camp's semi-arid and windy environment there on the high plains, which really tormented Amachians. There's an amazing woman that I've worked with who was there as a teenager, and she says, every time the wind blows, I think of camp. But that wind has actually served, and the sandy environment, to protect the historic camp landscape after it was closed and the buildings were dismantled in 1945. So the land was not developed, it was continued to be used for grazing, and that sandy native soil blew in and protected the historic features and living surfaces. So in recognition of its historical significance and its physical integrity, Amache was declared a National Historic Landmark in 2006. And what I'll be sharing with you today comes from 8 field seasons of research that started just after that time when Amache became a landmark. And it represents an important community collaboration. So it incorporates what we have learned as archaeologists working side by side and with and talking to Amache survivors and their families. And this synergy of working with community members is what I love so much about the work. And I'll be weaving in their stories and photographs throughout. And I think as a professor, this is particularly important because it makes this enterprise both scientifically and ethically sound, and it means it's a good training ground for future generations of archaeologists. So many of the photographs I'll be showing today have been carefully saved by families and then generously saved with us, shared with us. And these have even more depth when they come along with memories of camp. So George Hirano is kind of the handsome young man at the back of this photograph. Told me that the garden that they were posed in here was a family affair. So he and his brothers dug the garden to his mother's exacting specifications, and they also were in charge of watering it. And then she grew cucumbers in there, and she turned them into Japanese-style pickles, which, given the institutional foods that were served in the mess hall, something she was familiar with because she was one of the mess hall cooks, these were fresh and reassuringly familiar treat for her boys. We have focused our studies primarily in areas where the incarcerees lived, which are the barracks blocks. And these really help us understand daily life and the strategies of incarcerees for making camp more livable. We've also surveyed the public blocks, such as the elementary school and the high school and sports fields, and undeveloped areas that were used for informal trash disposal. And this painstaking work has served to really document how amazingly intact the cultural landscape of the site is. So we began by making sure to survey blocks that were occupied by people from the 3 main population areas of California that ended up at Amache. So there's the Japanese American occupants of these regions that are circled. So in the northern area, a lot of these folks were, they might have had poultry farms, and they often were also employed in sort of seasonal harvesting. So they were often kind of migratory families. In the central area, this is like the breadbasket of California, a part of the Central Valley, and this included 3 farming colonies who in fact sort of were removed and came intact to Amache. And then down south, it's an neighborhood of Los Angeles that was home to a number of produce stands and truck farmers, as well as nursery professionals and people who worked in other professions. So we began each field season doing a systematic walking survey. So it's really intensive. The crews are almost able to touch each other's hands as we walk. And the crews scan for objects on the surface and they call out what they find. And this helps us to create an inventory of everything we find in each block. And during the survey, crews specifically flag items that would benefit from additional analysis. that are otherwise related to our research questions, like those that are related to our landscape studies. So we document each of these in the field, and we collect only a very few for use in public education. And like that's, to me, a really important part of the ethics of this being an active heritage site, is that I want people to be able to go and engage with this, and this is particularly important for survivors and descendants. And while the crews are surveying, not only are they looking for individual artifacts, they're looking for activity areas that are visible on the surface of the site, and especially these garden and landscaping features. And some of them, like this one, utilize the same concrete out of which the barrack foundations that you can see behind it are constructed, while others are marked by trees or stones or plants that don't belong. We document the more complicated of the gardens and landscaping features with these scaled measure drawings. And it's pretty exacting work, but learning to make these maps is a really important part of student training and of documenting the camp landscape. So our finds are also mapped with digital equipment, and so that way we can create these extremely accurate maps of the blocks we've surveyed, but also the locations of our excavation units. And this is a good way for us to involve our survivor community, who they don't have to do as much bending down and up. They can use our electronic equipment. So this is an example of the digital maps that we've been creating, and they help us see these larger spatial relationships at camp because they are mapped in association with the actual remains of the foundation. So that's what's in yellow here, and then the purple, every single one of those is a landscaping feature. So you can see almost immediately how the barracks face each other and the doorways do. So what they're doing is they're creating in this block a real front yard landscape. So they're doing that as people are coming in and going. You can see each other. There's also a couple of big features that are in public areas of the block, and so it shows us sort of where such things are located and just how common they often are. And this really pairs well with historic photographs that show not just how raw the site was when incarcerees arrived. It was bulldozed for construction, so that made it a gritty nightmare every time the wind blew, which, as you heard, was all the time. And then these later pictures support our archaeological findings, which is that incarcerees didn't just change this landscape, they radically transformed it. They essentially took a prison and turned it into a town. And from the outset of the project, I was really interested in how Amachians were taking this expertise that I knew they had, and so many of them had in growing things, as well as also the values and aesthetics of the greater Japanese world, and applying them into this new environment of the high plains of Colorado, especially through landscaping and gardening. And I'm also really interested in what these features reveal about connections and strategies inside and outside of camp in a situation of upheaval and shortage, which really also connects this work to a larger work about the archaeology of the World War II home front. So the garden features at Amachi, like those at the other WRA camps, tend to fall into three types. So the first are these entryway gardens that I was showing you. They're found near the doorways of barracks, and they have their roots in the courtyard or Suboniwa gardens of Japan. So they also reflect the front yards that gardeners of Japanese ancestry were creating for their clients and themselves in the west coast of the United States. And I also want to point out, because of your theme this week, or during the Lenten period, is that this right here, I don't know if you can see my arrow, yes you can, that is a native plant that they have allowed to flourish in their garden. And we see a lot of examples of this, also through the archaeology. So these are our entryway gardens. So the second type of gardens are these are ornamental gardens that are in the common areas of blocks, and so and they such as along the edges of the mess halls. And there's a sketch of a beautiful mess hall pond that we excavated this last year down below there, and a historic photograph of a different pond that is sort of in the central park part of Amachi. And these are often located near the one single spigot that existed in these blocks so that they could have a water feature. The final kind of garden are vegetable gardens, which during the war, both inside and outside of camp, are known as victory gardens. And there is certainly a patriotic zeal to these, even within the camp. So beginning in 2008, we've conducted test excavations in at least a dozen gardens that cover each of these different types. And some we can identify using historic photographs like this one, which was taken from the camp's water tower. But others we have just a hint of on the surface of the site. And in both instances, we've employed what's called ground penetrating radar, or GPR, prior to excavation. And it's sort of like sonar, but through the soil. And it allows us to create images of what is buried. And this really helps us decide whether or not a garden is in fact a garden, and if it's worth excavating, if it has enough physical integrity that it's worth opening up. And so this bottom slide shows how GPR revealed what that was from the surface, only a partially visible feature, that it was in fact one of two intact oval features. And that also it was a garden bed and not a pond, because otherwise the whole thing would have had this bright green color with the concrete bouncing up. What you see right there is actually an existing stepping stone that was just below the surface. So after we analyze the ground penetrating radar, we can open up really targeted test excavation units, and we employ intensive garden archaeology techniques. By opening up big areas, we can really focus on revealing the activity in the garden, as well as how they were planned and what was planted in them. And in order for us to really be able to assess these gardens, not only do we screen the soil, which is something you might have seen archaeologists do before, and this is another great job for our survivor volunteers. We find them a nice shady spot so they can set up and work on the screens with us. But we also take soil samples so that we can recover things like seeds, but also microscopic remains such as pollen. So another important thing that we look at is the soil itself. The soils at Amache are classified by the Soil Conservation Service as overly drained sand. And so they are low in organics and nutrients. And so assessing if and how the incarcerees were amending this soil was another way where we could really see the application of horticultural expertise. And so to do that, I've employed a program of soil chemistry sampling that involves a number of soil chemists on our as consultants. And in order to be able to do that, we need to not just look at the soil in the gardens, right? We have to compare it to the soil that's outside of the gardens to be able to do that. So our first excavation in a garden back in 2008 was one of two matching oval beds in the public area of the block of 9L, which is what the one that I showed you earlier on the overall map. And excavation revealed a number of important aspects of this garden. The garden walls were made of cinder blocks, which were carefully split into 4 pieces. And a few whole examples remained around the site so that we could see what they originally looked like. And as used, they're very deliberately cut and shaped, and they look like a pretty passable mock basalt, which is a far more typical material for a Japanese garden. And it was one of our first chances to see the ingenuity of Amache's gardeners in how they transformed institutional materials in their gardens. The layout of the garden, as revealed at excavation, was also something of a surprise. Counter to our ideas of a typical Japanese design, these gardens had a real studied symmetry, from the overall circular, oval beds to the plantings within them. So like this planting was just directly in the center, because we set up our excavation units so they would bisect the bed. And I know from research that in this block, which was primarily occupied by people from Los Angeles, we had over 10 professional gardeners. And so I think this really reflects their experience in the United States and is a really important reminder that these are not Japanese gardens and they're not American gardens, they're Japanese-American gardens. So the center planting hole yielded much of the intact root system of a 1940s planting, and my archaeobotanist was able to identify it as a Siberian elm. So again, Siberian elms, are sometimes also known as Chinese elms, are one of those trees where you better really want to plant it, because once it gets going, you are never going to get rid of it. But they turned out to be a really great choice out here because they are the trees that are still alive, if they have survived. This one did not. The other thing that our excavations revealed is that there was a stain from a stake in the ground, and we had copper wire. And that copper wire, you imagine during the war, that copper is not something that you are supposed to have access to except for military uses. So it is one of our examples of many of midnight requisitioning, likely, of things to make these gardens possible. We also found a hook that would probably likely have held maybe a lantern that would have hung from this tree. And the botanical remains recovered from the Oval Garden indicate that it likely had a deliberately planted ground cover of wild purslane. And purslane seeds occurred only in the planting hole fill and those lower fills within the garden, but not above and below. And purslane is, again, not a plant that's really associated with Japanese gardening tradition, but it's drought tolerant, it's nearby, and it's a moderately attractive ground cover, and having that there would have helped the tree itself thrive. So after the excavations were complete, I met a man who not only recalled this garden, he actually sent us pictures of his family taken in it. And these document the visit of 2 servicemen who were on leave after basic training and before being shipped off to fight in Europe. And these Amachians actually chose to capture this important moment in their family's history, not in front of their barrack, but in a garden, something that masks that camp landscape and doesn't sort of poison these pictures forever, right? And Anna Tamura, who's a landscape architect for the National Park Service, has noted that this practice is common for people who were in many of the camps. And it recalls what Jean Wagasuki Houston wrote about the Manzanar Gardens, that when you were in them, you could, for a while, not be a prisoner. So one of the most important ways that the DU Amachi project assists in the management of the site is by investigating areas to be impacted by planned developments. So this photograph is again taken from the camp's iconic water tower, which was due to be rebuilt and returned. And we knew from these photos that there were victory gardens that were very near the tower, and we wanted to make sure that they were protected while the work was going to happen. So in 2010, we used ground penetrating radar again to identify this garden. And unlike the Oval Garden, which had a wall or hardscaping, this one was just demarcated by this light wooden and wire fence that you can see in the historic photograph. And so by careful use of the ground penetrating radar, my crews had to basically hand prune all of any plant that was above the ground. It's very exacting work. We were able to get a good ground penetrating radar, and so we hypothesized the thing that's circled on there, these are called point source reflections, that this is actually the metal of the fence that was showing up. And so when we opened up the excavation units, we were really pleased to find that this alignment of wood and wire right where the ground penetrating radar predicted that we'd find this fence. The other thing that this fence did for us is that, again, that overly drained soil, here's the thing about pollen. Pollen is actually smaller than the sand grains. So when it rains, the pollen moves down through. So we can't take pollen from everywhere. We have to take pollen from where we either have an umbrella or a bucket. And that something about the way that the garden is will help us capture that. And so right from underneath where that piece of wood is where we dug out all the pollen for our pollen samples from this garden, and we were rewarded with the pollen of potatoes. So we know that they were growing potatoes in this garden. The other thing we were rewarded with was to discover that this garden had amazingly, significantly amended soil. It had elevated nitrogen and phosphorus, and also a more neutral pH than the parent soil. So they really did a lot to make this garden grow. And so when we left, we flagged out the far corners of the garden, having discovered where it was, so that they could be avoided by construction crews and so that it is preserved for the future. And in this garden, and the garden I showed you before, in almost every one of these gardens, we only excavate a portion of them, because I'm hoping that in the future people will be smarter than me and they will have other techniques, and that we are preserving them in the ground for future research. That same summer, we also excavated a portion of this garden, which is directly in front of a barrack occupied by Soichiro and Boone Hirota. And they were an older couple who had managed a furniture store in Los Angeles, so not professional gardeners. And as we dug, though, it became clear that the soil in this garden was amended by really carefully crumbled eggshell. It was just all throughout the garden. And it was also in these two things that I want you to take a note of. These little containers, they're like little sunken plant pots, but they are actually, I'll show you a close-up of them, they are broken pipe that has been set down on the ground, and those, also the soil in them had the eggshell too, to let us know that they had planted something in them. So that summer, we were very lucky to be visited by a former incarceree who recalled that eggshell, tea leaves, and coffee grounds were all highly prized soil amendments. But something I hadn't thought of that she told me is that not everyone had access to them. You had to know people. So you had to know people who worked in the mess hall, because they're going to get you to these food remains that then you can compost in your garden. And the other thing that is back to this broken water pipe is that not everybody would have had access to broken construction materials, right? And so this elderly couple, who are probably not on the trash crew, but probably had a neighbor who did, what's amazing is to see all the networks that they're pulling from to be able to beautify this place that they didn't live. You know, they're not professional gardeners, but they're ingenious and they're connected. So one of the many surprises that are revealed by the gardens of Amachi are about the relationship of incarcerees to the larger physical and social environment. They made great use of materials that are near but beyond the barbed wire perimeter of the camp. So lots of the gardens include river cobble and gravel from the Arkansas River, which is just 3 miles north of camp, but actually on the edge of those farms that were the fields that were being farmed. So those would have been relatively easy access to those materials. But also, we find things like transplanted wild species, and not just ones that are on site, like the purslane, but this cholla, which is a cactus that doesn't actually grow anywhere very near Amachi, which is something that a local rancher confirmed for me when I was out there taking that picture. And if there's somebody who knows about where cactus belongs and doesn't, it is a rancher. So I'm trusting that. And geological sourcing has also allowed us to identify that many of the stones that we find at Amachi, again, this is just basically sand dunes. So any stone that we find out there, somebody's brought with them. And some of them they brought, again, not just from the Arkansas, but from very far away. Some places in areas where the Boy Scouts were camping, and even all the way to the foothills of the Rockies. And it's important to know that stones are such a traditional part of Japanese gardens, and that just like trees, stones have spirit, they have kami. So it would have been very important to bring these beautiful stones back. If you're, a kid who is at Bible camp, and you can bring a stone like this back for your grandma or grandpa to put in their garden. The results of the pollen analysis are also truly surprising. We find evidence of all kinds of plants that would have been very difficult to grow on the high plains: dogwood, cattail, and this one, which is canna. And it's a flowering tropical plant that's related to ginger. And really, only a skilled gardener would have gotten these to thrive well enough to actually produce pollen. And we've gotten them from multiple gardens at Amachi. And most of the gardens were not made by experts in Japanese garden design, but they're certainly shaped by traditional beliefs such as Shintoism and the belief in kami, as well as traditional philosophy such as motenai, which is the idea that, a perfect one for your conversations, that reuse is a virtue and waste is a shame, motenai. So like the Hirota garden that used broken pipe, this garden employed trash, which is busted up tile to make garden paving. So a few of the gardens were made by experts, like the gentleman who designed this entryway garden that we excavated in 2012. So before the war, one of them had worked as a gardener for the LA Railway, while the other had owned a cactus nursery. So I want you to, can you see the impression of the prickly pear cactus here? So what's so cool about it is that there's this concept in Japanese garden called shake, which means borrowed scenery. And so by utilizing this piece of concrete that's been poured over cactus, this is an entryway garden. You can bring that cactus into your garden without having to risk walking past it every single day. And I love the idea of this, very millennial old technique being accommodated through the often unlovely material of concrete. But concrete is a material that they had access to and they made great use of. And I think it also has so much more resonance when we know that at least one of these gardeners was an expert in growing cactus. The younger generation of incarcerees was also involved in efforts to landscape the camp. So after a controversy over the cost of the specialty-built Amachi High School, the WRA abandoned plans to build an elementary school, and instead a regular barracks block was pressed into service. And so these kids were going in and out of these buildings all the time into this sort of blowing sandstorm. And in an article published by the school administrators indicated that the students themselves actually came to them and said, we would like to landscape our school. I think they're obviously being impressed by the work that their parents and grandparents are doing. And it's really interesting because in this school journal, it's really published as talking about a kind of reflection of American ideals that the education department is trying to impress. And certainly the overall landscaping scheme that resulted would have been reassuringly Americanized or Western to administrator eyes. So you can see in our survey, and you can see it in the pictures here, where the beds are almost all have a limestone outline. They're all about the same size, but and placed up against the buildings. But the excavation in a pair of beds, right next to each other, that flank a doorway, really tell a different story. And so here's a close-up of the kids doing some of that landscaping. And this is one of the photographs that was included in the article. So these beds were approximately the same size, and they're both bounded by limestone, but this one, is filled with this gravel, and a consistent size of gravel. They would have had to sort through it from the banks of the Arkansas River. And the adjacent bed had no gravel at all. So we have a dry garden and then a different garden. And in one, we recovered ornamental morning glory seeds, but none in the other. And what I love about this is that these very different adjacent school gardens tell us that these young children are already developing their own landscape aesthetic. And then they are carrying it on, this tradition of the Subo Niwa, of the courtyard garden, in this most unlikely place. So I consider one of my primary tasks as an archaeologist to notice patterns in the material traces of humans' behavior and then try to figure them out. And over the course of these 8 seasons of archaeological research at Amachi, one of the most robust patterns is the ubiquity of gardens. In every single block occupied by Japanese Americans confined at Amachi, we find gardens of different size, composition, and complexity. And there are many gardens, there are many answers to the question of why there are so many gardens at Amachi, and some of them are certainly quotidian. So veggies from Victory Garden add variety to a mess hall diet. Gardens keep the grit down in a region that's only coming out of the Dust Bowl. Evaporation from ponds like this one on the slide would have created more equitable microclimates during the hot summer. And fast-growing plants like morning glories hide shabby institutional architecture. But the energy poured into these gardens, and my study of both Japanese garden history and horticultural therapy have really convinced me that gardening was ideally suited to help the people of Japanese ancestry at Amachi imprisoned there cope with a nearly unlivable situation. So they lived in a world where the social ground was constantly shifting. So one day you're in high school or you're an optometrist, and the next you're a prisoner with no idea when or if you'll be released. Those who were immigrants were people who were literally without a country, while their children who were citizens were part of a country that had turned its back on them. But they had this set of skills honed over generations for bringing balance to at least one little part of their world, and that's their gardens. So in 2012, we excavated what turned out to be a stunning Japanese-style entryway garden. And one of the reasons that I chose to further investigate it is this primary feature, which is a wall that evokes stone but is made out of concrete. And not only is it a little miniature mountain range, it's also sited right in front of the doorway to the barrack. And when we removed the blown-in soil between the wall and that doorway, we uncovered this beautiful cedar walkway that led directly to the wall. And from there, we have stepping stones that suggest pathways to either side. So each time someone passed through this entryway and around this wall, I always joked with my students that if this was in my house, I would trip over that wall every single day. But these folks who lived here would have to slow down and be mindful for just that moment. And that kind of mindfulness is one of the goals, especially of Japanese tea garden design, where it helps you be in yourself and be ready to transition from the outside world to the inside world. And that is a kind of that mindfulness, you can imagine how elusive that would be in a place of confinement, and here they've built it into the architecture. Another element of harmony created by the Amachi gardeners is that kind of deep balance that we've discovered through our study of soil chemistry. And you know you got to be a nerd to get super excited about this. But I will tell you right now, we have found so many interesting soil amendments, not just eggshell, but also marine shell, fish bones and scales, and even iron slag from the blacksmith shop at the ranch. In almost every single garden feature that we have analyzed so far, the soil retains more nutrients to support plant life than those from those control pits or in non-garden areas. And so, again, considering the quickness with which nutrients would be washed from this sandy matrix and the short duration of that, 3 years of their occupation, this imprint is nothing short of amazing. There remains 80 years later a legacy of care for a land by people who were forced to inhabit it. I want you to think about that. So, but to really grapple with the Amachi gardens, or any garden, we have to think not just about the art, but the act. So the physicality of creating and maintaining a garden is yet another of its virtues. So those daily chores of watering or seasonal efforts like picking up fallen leaves or harvesting, these keep a garden in harmony, but they also keep the people engaging in them in harmony. And physiological studies have shown time after time again, and they're merging with like this 700-year-old quote from Muso Soseki, who designed one of the first Zen garden temples, that gardens are important because of the way that you make them. And that when you take care of your gardens, you actually take care of yourself. And that these physiological, study after study show that being in a garden helps reduce the physiological signs of stress, of anxiety, and of trauma, and working in them is even more effective. But I think also in taking care of their gardens, they not just took care of themselves, but they took care of each other. And one of the best parts of my work is spending so much time with Amachi survivors, and especially Carlene Tanagoshi Tinker, who is like my grandma now. And she was 3 when the train carrying her family pulled into Grenada, and she barely remembers her time at Amachi, and a lot because her parents refused to speak about it. And so for 7 field seasons, she only missed the very first year, has been a stalwart member of our crew. And she says that doing archaeology at Amachi has helped her dig for her roots. And I've really seen firsthand how being on there has helped her recover childhood memories and to learn more. And that relationship is reciprocal because we often learn from Carlene's experiences. And that was particularly true in 2008 when we excavated near the recreation hall where it turns out that she went to preschool. So we got back from the field, she helped us do the ground penetrating radar and the excavations, and then she sent me her preschool card, like her grade from preschool, and it said that same block. And she had told us about taking naps with her little blankie as a preschooler. And then during our studies that we found that there was a careful alignment of trees that were all on the south side of the building. So this would have shaded this building that was filled with little tykes. And I think it helps us think about that as a landscape of care. So the picture that comes from the gardens of Amachi is that of resourceful, imaginative, and skilled people. And I also want to say spiritual people as well. So this photograph of this garden is just around the corner from one of the Buddhist temples at Amachi. There were 2 Buddhist temples. And I interviewed Helen, who is actually in that photograph with her cousin. And she talked about this garden as being a part of her grandfather's spiritual practice, because he made this in part, and it wrapped all the way around his barrack so that as people went to temple, they could walk past this beautiful space. And I think that what is so amazing is that despite the fact that they are literally being singled out for their ancestry, they did not abandon it, but they expressed it insistently and really creatively. And so I think they've really left for us a legacy of dignity and insistence on their own humanity despite outside forces bent on denying it. It's the day of remembrance today, so it's a tough day. But good news. As I'm sure you guys know, as of March 2022, Amachi will become a national park. And so this legacy will remain for generations to come. Excuse me. And I was just talking to someone. There is, I want to show you one of our legacies is those roses there that you can see next to a barrack. And there's now a documentary about the Amachi Rose. So it's playing twice a day at Denver Botanic Gardens. It plays at 10 and noon. So if you find yourself at the gardens and you can go out and see, they're planted. There's some of the Amachi roses that they've propagated that are out in the Plains Garden, but you can also go and see the movie. And I also know that apparently there's going to be a giveaway of some books here. I'm happy to sign them, and also if you want to write down that discount code, my publisher has been fantastic, and you can get the book for 40% off with that CLAR20 code, but you have to order it through the University Press of Colorado. Don't give Amazon your money, give it to these guys. So I always say it takes a village to do archaeology. So here's my village, and amazing support in terms of, you can imagine how expensive it is to feed all of those college students and to hire a palynologist. That's a very specialized skill. So I want to acknowledge all these folks, and I'll leave the slides up here while I take some questions in case there's some slides I can go back to refer to. So thank you so much for being here. Oh, I also want to point out that I have a few of the project newsletters are out on the table with the snacks. and a sign-up sheet. So if you didn't get a chance, if they're all gone, please sign up for one. Or if you'd like to get them electronically to share with people, you can just sign up on the newsletter mailing list, and I'll send you the electronic version. Yes. So I didn't say that, did I? I'm always sort of adjusting for time, and so there were at Amachi. It's the smallest of the camps, so it was. The height of the population was just a little over 7,000 people, but because people moved from camp to camp, over 10,000 people passed through Amachi. And it was the 10th largest city in Colorado during the war, just like overnight. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry.
You have a free day. Just takes one day. You can drive out there to Grenada and go and see this and see what a lot of different communities or people of interest are doing. When I was out there were 2 Japanese American ladies who were children at this camp, and they were helping to restore this camp. It's a terrific opportunity to learn about our mistakes and then what people are doing about it to correct those mistakes. Additionally, on March 14th, Denver Botanic Gardens, as you referenced, is having a Komachi Day, and you can learn there and see some of the plants that were grown out there.
Yeah, really quick. If anyone is interested in learning more about Amachi and the community that grew in Denver after World War II, after Amachi closed down, there will be an observance this afternoon at the Colorado History Museum from 1 till 4. Dr. Clark mentioned Executive Order 9066. And annually, there is a ceremony held here called the Day of Remembrance. And it is particularly pertinent for today because today is the day that that executive order was issued in 1942. And you'll be able to hear testimony. There may be 1 or 2 survivors who are there, certainly children of survivors. And I assume you'll have a table there, Dr. Clark, as you usually do?
Yes, I will. And we will actually have one of the objects from one of our garden excavations there this summer, as well as some items that are related to the preschool, so about kids in the camp.
And it is always interesting because every year there are new things that come out from different people. For example, there are people who live here who were children incarcerated in a camp at Crystal City, Texas. There's a book called The Train to Crystal City, and it is the only camp in the United States where citizens were gathered from Italy, Germany, Japan, and incarcerated there and basically held as hostages to exchange for Americans who had been captured and imprisoned overseas. And so it's a fascinating book, and I didn't even know about that until the Day of Remembrance ceremony a couple of years ago. But if you're interested in learning more, that is certainly a way to do that. And my grandparents were not incarcerated, but they were forcibly relocated, or chose to relocate to Colorado because of Governor Ralph Carr, who opened Colorado to Japanese from the West Coast. And my father's parents were farmers in the Bay Area and relocated here because they had friends here who would take them in. My mother's parents were in southern Wyoming, where my grandfather worked for the Union Pacific Railroad, and Executive Order 9066 required that he relocate 100 miles away from the public utility where he was employed, lest he sabotage it. Not thinking that there were railroads here, whether he could have sabotaged, but anyway. They came to Denver, and because of Executive Order 966, my parents were here and met, and I'm here because of that. So, interesting side effects.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that and for plugging the Day of Remembrance. I was going to do it, and now you have. So, yeah, it's today a great event from 1 to 4 at History Colorado. It's free. If you come in, you can also go see the Amache exhibit on the floors above, and there's usually yummy snacks. So.
What is the origin of the name Amache?
So Amache is really interesting, and it's we've been having a lot of talks with the Park Service about this. So it was the postal designation because you have Grenada and Grenada, and it was the only one of the camps that was named for the town nearby, and it was just sort of it was like a male nightmare. And so they suggested that it have a different postal designation. So it's named for Amache Ocheni Prowers, and she is Cheyenne, and the county that where the camp is named after John and Amache Prowers. And so, and sort of as a Cheyenne woman, and that evocation of that connection, I think, is really important, especially given that her father was killed at Sand Creek. So it connects these two new parks in a really interesting way to help us think about that really complicated history of the Colorado Prairie.
What was the most surprising thing? You've been working on this project for more than a decade, and I know it's just remarkable and so powerful. Looking back now, what do you think has most surprised you from your work?
Gosh, so many things. I will say that I was absolutely tickled and kind of floored to find iron slag from the blacksmith shop. And we found it in, again, one of these gardens, the one that I showed you with the wall that had the concrete impression. Again, so clearly very skilled people. I had a student who did some research. So iron is leached out of soil that is near concrete. So by adding that in, it would have meant that garden would have been more productive. And so again, they've got to know somebody. These guys are in their 70s. They're not working in the blacksmith shop, I don't think. They find out that it's there, they find somebody, they get it, and then they just carefully sprinkle it through this garden. And it was also one of the reasons why, when we take our soil samples, I tried to not get too much into the weeds and the methodology with you guys, but we take these basically big bags of dirt, and we bring them back to the lab, and then we use them. That machine that I showed you actually separates out. It'll take me a while to get back there, but it separates out the soil from the botanical remains, because botanical remains float to the top. And then, but what we also get is all the dirt underneath that normally would fall through my screen, and so I might lose it. So that's the flotation tank right there. And so all that little stuff is in a window screen. And so making my students sort through that, they're like, their eyes roll back in their head. And then, but it was one of my students who was finding it. She's like, what is this thing, Bonnie? And I looked at it. I was like, I think it's iron slag, but it's not magnetic, because iron, if you heat it to a certain Curie point, actually is no longer magnetic. So I had to actually go, and I used a different instrument that showed me that it was in fact iron. And so then I did some research about slag, and then once one student found it, we found it in every single of the heavy fraction from that garden. So now I show my students what it looks like so that they can look through it. But this is also the garden where I recovered fish bones and fish scales. So they were like knowing what they did. And again, I was just And I talked to a fellow archaeologist who says to me the thing that he thinks is most remarkable about this is how much work they put into amending the soil. Again, in a temporary situation, but it's like that's the right way to grow things. That's the way to make things flourish. And it's just, to me, amazing. The level of sophistication and all the work that went into, again, creating something that you would hope would be super temporary, right? That you hope that you don't have to be there the next spring, and yet, just in case you're going to be, you're going to make sure that not only have you planted the plants, but you've given them the environment they need to thrive.
I'm so sorry to cut this off, but we are out of time, or just about. And I did want to tell you a few more things. Here is the Green Team's Lenten calendar that I mentioned. It's out on the table. It's absolutely fabulous, so please pick one up. And we have books out on the table. They have gone very fast. I am going to get more. The publisher has been wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and order some more. So if you're interested in getting a copy of the book, there will be more coming in the weeks to come. But in the meantime, I did tell you we would have a giveaway for 2 books, and that's happening right now. And so I picked seats at the beginning before you all sat down, and they're only in my head, so you just have to trust me, because I didn't want to make everyone dig through their legs for a Post-it note or something. So Sam and Sarah, thank you for sitting up front. And so, sorry, Caroline. Thank you for sitting up front. Yes, absolutely. In terms of the book, our own John Brand. John, would you wave? John's sitting in the back there. He didn't get a book because he sat in the back. John, but God bless John. He is going to lead a discussion group about finding solace in the soil on March 15th, which is a cathedral night at 7 o'clock here at St. John's. So please plan to come for that. That will be fabulous. And gosh, Green Team, have I forgotten anything?
Thank you so much. I mean, when she came was February 2018, and she had just written a journal article, and this is even more fascinating. And thank you, thank you, thank you.
Please make sure to put your cups in the compost.
3 cheers for
Make sure to
composting.
put your cups in the compost. Thank you all. Bonnie does have a few minutes, so if you want to get a book signed, if you want to ask a question that you didn't get to, that's fine. Otherwise, please join us at 10:30 for our Choral Eucharist in the cathedral and online at sjcathedral.org. Thank you all so much.